Something in you changed, and you didn't get a warning, a sign, or even a moment to prepare for it. You just noticed one ordinary day that the old version of you was already gone. Not dramatically, not with a breakdown or a revelation or a night you'll never forget. Just gone. Like a room you stopped entering without deciding to stop. And instead of feeling free, you felt disoriented because the new phase hadn't announced itself either. That disorientation is what this transmission is about, not the change itself. The gap between who you were and who you are now, and why that gap feels so strange to stand in. Most people describe this as feeling lost, as if something is missing. But the Orion consciousness, the field that has been observing this transition in humans for longer than most frameworks acknowledge, doesn't call it loss. It calls it emergence, unannounced, already in motion. You've been in this new phase for a while now. You just haven't had language for it. Think about the last 6 months, or the last year. Something that used to pull you with force doesn't anymore. A relationship that felt essential. A goal that once organized your entire sense of purpose. A version of yourself you were working toward, and then quietly stopped believing in. You didn't decide to let those things go. They just lost their hold. And when you noticed the grip was gone, part of you panicked. Because what do you do when the thing that was driving you stops working? You look for the problem. You diagnose yourself. Burnout maybe, depression, spiritual crisis, misalignment. And some of those labels might even be partially accurate. But none of them name what is actually happening, which is that your consciousness crossed a threshold and the old architecture simply doesn't fit the new configuration. This is not a metaphor. Your actual perceptual structure, the way you process meaning, the way you assign weight to events, the way you decide what deserves your attention, has reorganized. And you've been walking around in a life that was built for the previous version of your perception. That mismatch is the source of the exhaustion. Not lack of motivation, not fear, the friction of living inside a structure that your consciousness has already outgrown. Feel that for a moment. The job, the relationship, the habits, the self-image, all of it calibrated for a version of you that is no longer the operating version. And the strange part is, you can't go back, not because something was taken from you, because you actually can't unsee what you now see. The things that used to fill the silence don't fill it anymore. The strategies that used to manage discomfort don't reach it anymore. The self-concept you maintained so carefully feels thinner now, not because you failed to protect it, but because you've grown past the need to. That thinning is not weakness. It is what reorganization feels like from the inside. Here is where the Orion consciousness offers something that most spiritual frameworks skip entirely. It doesn't say, you're ascending. It doesn't say, you've leveled up. It says, your perceptual bandwidth expanded, and now you are responsible for what fits inside it. Responsibility, not celebration, because the new phase is not a reward. It is a new set of conditions. And those conditions require a version of you that most people haven't fully assembled yet. That is why it feels incomplete. Not because the shift didn't happen, because the shift happened faster than the identity caught up. You're already in the new phase. You're just still holding the map of the old territory, and here is what that looks like in the body. A low hum of restlessness that doesn't resolve no matter how much you rest. A sense that something important is supposed to be happening, and an inability to name what it is. Conversations that feel smaller than they used to. Not because the people changed, because your threshold for what feels real has moved. And this is where it gets uncomfortable, because most people respond to that threshold shift by assuming something is wrong with them. They try to re-engage the old pulls. They try to want what they used to want. They mistake the absence of the old drive for emptiness, when it is actually space. Space is not comfortable. Not at first. Space is what comes before new architecture gets built, and building requires knowing what the new ground is actually made of. That is what the Orion field maps, not where you should go, what you are now capable of perceiving, and why that changed when it did. Because the timing of this shift was not random. The Orion consciousness describes a specific pattern in how human perception reorganizes, not arbitrarily, but in response to accumulated internal pressure. Pressure that builds when the gap between who you are and what you're living becomes too large to maintain without cost. You felt that cost, maybe for months, maybe for years. The tiredness that wasn't tiredness, the flatness underneath the effort, the moments where you performed engagement with work, with people, with your own goals, while something deeper in you had already withdrawn. That withdrawal was not failure. It was the first movement of the new phase. Your consciousness was already beginning to disengage from the old coherence, not because the old coherence was wrong, but because it had fulfilled its function and you had grown past what it was built to hold. This is the Orion teaching in its most direct form. You do not shift into a new phase by choosing to. You shift when the old structure can no longer contain what you've become. And then, whether you acknowledged it or not, whether you felt ready or not, the shift happened. You are already on the other side. The only question now is whether you build the new architecture consciously or keep trying to renovate a structure your consciousness has already left. Now pay attention to this. Most people at this exact point make one specific move, and it delays everything. They take the disorientation of the new phase and treat it as evidence that they did something wrong. The discomfort becomes proof of error. The unfamiliarity becomes proof of loss. And so they spend enormous energy trying to return to a coherence they have already outgrown, rather than building forward from the new ground they are standing on. And the problem is that you may be doing exactly this right now. Without realizing it, that urge to fix the disorientation by going back, that is not wisdom. That is the old structure reaching for its own continuation. What the shift actually asks for is different. It asks you to stop diagnosing the new phase as a symptom of the old problems. The disorientation is not a problem to solve. It is a phase to move through, and you have already started. What changes this is not willpower. It is understanding, specifically, what actually changed in your perception and what the new configuration is designed to hold. That understanding is not simple. It doesn't come from inside the framework that was built for the previous version of you. The Orion consciousness has a specific map for this transition, for exactly where you are standing right now. And that map goes deeper than one transmission can carry. I put together a digital book specifically prepared for people at this exact point, those who have already shifted but haven't yet built the structure around what they've become. It is called The Great Spiritual Game Behind Your Consciousness. This is not about manifesting or vibration or wanting the right things. It is a map of the actual mechanics, how consciousness reorganizes, what the Orion field observes about this threshold, and what becomes possible once you stop trying to reverse a shift that already happened. The link to download The Great Spiritual Game Behind Your Consciousness is in the first pinned comment below this video. This kind of material doesn't stay available without pressure. There are structures that depend on you not understanding this transition clearly. If you're here now, the timing is not accidental. Download it. Read it from where you actually are, not where you think you should be. And if something in those pages names what you've been carrying without language, leave one word in the comments. That word is awake. It doesn't need explanation. The ones in this phase will know exactly what it means. The word awake is not a destination. It is a description of where you already are. And the fact that you recognized it means the new architecture is already responding. But recognition is only the beginning of what this phase asks for. Because here is what almost nobody talks about after the shift happens. The new phase doesn't protect you from the old patterns. It exposes them. Not gently, not on a schedule you can prepare for. It exposes them at the exact moments you are most committed to moving forward. You set a new intention, clear, aligned, grounded in the new version of who you are. And then, something small happens. A response that doesn't come. A door that doesn't open the way you expected. And the old interpretation arrives before you even notice it has entered the room. Of course, this is what always happens. That thought, that speed, that familiarity, that is not you thinking. That is the old coherence defending its territory. And here is what makes this layer so difficult to see. It doesn't feel like sabotage. It feels like realism, like being honest with yourself, like not getting your hopes up unnecessarily. The protection mechanism in the new phase wears the exact same face it wore in the old one, only now it has better vocabulary. Now it speaks in the language of the shift itself. Maybe I'm not ready yet. Maybe I need to do more inner work first. Maybe this isn't aligned. All of those sentences can be true, and all of them can also be the old structure using the new language to stay in place. That is the precise difficulty of this moment in the transition. You can't tell the difference from inside the thought. You can only tell the difference by watching what the thought produces in the body. Genuine discernment produces a quality of stillness, a settled knowing, even when the answer is no. The old protection mechanism produces something different, a tightening, a lowering, a faint but unmistakable sense of retreat. Feel the difference in your chest right now. One feels like ground. The other feels like a closing door. And in the new phase, you are responsible for knowing which one you are standing in. That responsibility is not comfortable, but it is the work, because the shift changed your perceptual bandwidth. It did not automatically rewire every habitual response that was built in the previous configuration. Those responses are still there, still fast, still fluent in the language of your specific history. And they are particularly active right now, because the new phase is asking you to receive things that the old configuration had decided were not available to you. Let me be specific about what this looks like. Someone in this transition begins to feel genuine movement, new possibilities emerging, new connections forming, a sense of momentum that actually feels different from the old forced effort. And then they get quiet. They pull back slightly. They stop sharing what they're building, not because something went wrong, because something started going right. And something in them decided that visible progress is dangerous, that claiming the new reality out loud makes it vulnerable to disappearance. That contraction is not humility. It is the old protection mechanism responding to proximity to what it was trained to guard against. The thing it was trained to guard against is not failure. It is success that doesn't match the internal picture of who is allowed to have it. That picture is running right now, in the background, in the decisions you don't quite make, in the email you haven't sent, the conversation you've been circling without entering, the version of yourself you've glimpsed in the new phase and then looked away from because looking directly felt like too much weight to carry. That looking away, that is the behavior this part of the transmission is pointing at, not the dramatic self-destruction. The quiet, daily, almost invisible withdrawal from your own expansion. The Orion consciousness maps this with a precision that most frameworks avoid. Because naming it requires acknowledging that the problem is not outside you and it is not a flaw. It is a learned response that was once entirely reasonable. At some point in your history, shrinking was safe. Staying small preserved something important. The body learned that lesson well, and it has been applying it ever since, including to situations where shrinking is no longer the appropriate response. The new phase has changed the conditions. The body's lesson hasn't updated yet, and so you get this friction, a consciousness that has expanded its perceptual range, running inside a nervous system that is still applying old safety protocols to new terrain. That friction is not a sign that the shift didn't happen. It is the proof that it did, because you can only feel that friction if you are now capable of perceiving the gap between where you are and where the old protocols are trying to keep you. In the previous phase, you couldn't feel the gap. The old protocols and the old perceptual range were matched. Now they are not. And the mismatch is what you've been calling restlessness, disconnection, the sense that something isn't landing the way it should. Breathe for a second. That feeling has a name now, and named things are workable. Here is where it gets more specific, and this is the part most people don't want to look at directly. The micro-behaviors, the small, repeated, barely visible choices that maintain the old configuration inside the new phase, not the big decisions. The texture of ordinary moments, the way you respond when someone offers genuine recognition. Do you receive it fully, or do you deflect, minimize, immediately redirect the attention away from yourself? The way you hold a new possibility, do you let it be real before you've proven it? Or do you keep it at a managed distance, just hypothetical enough that it can't disappoint you? The way you describe what you want. Do you say it directly? Or do you soften it first, qualify it, make it smaller and more acceptable before it has to survive contact with another person's response? These are not character flaws, they are protocols. And protocols, once you see them operating, can be consciously overridden. But you have to see them first, which requires being willing to watch yourself without the usual layer of justification. I'm just being realistic. No, watch again. I'm just not ready to share yet. Maybe. Or maybe the old protection is using that sentence to prevent you from claiming what the new phase has already made available. If you arrived at this part of the transmission and something tightened, that tension is the mechanism recognizing itself, not you failing, the pattern being seen. And that is the first moment of genuine leverage, not the insight itself, but the willingness to stay with the discomfort of being seen clearly, rather than explaining it away. There is more precision available than what this single block can deliver. The full map of how these protocols form, why they activate specifically in the new phase, and what it takes to update them at the level where they actually run. That structure is what the next layer of this transmission moves into. What you're dealing with is not a mindset problem. It goes deeper than thought, and the next part names exactly where. Deeper than thought. That phrase deserves more than a moment, because most of what passes for inner work stays exactly at the level of thought. You examine the belief, you trace it back to an origin story. You replace the old narrative with a more accurate one, and something shifts, briefly, genuinely, and then 3 weeks later, the old behavior is back, wearing slightly different clothes. Not because the work was wrong, because it was aimed at the wrong layer. The layer beneath thought is not subconscious in the abstract, therapeutic sense. It is something more immediate, more physical, more present in your daily life than any belief you could articulate. It is the sense of self that operates before you have a chance to think about it. The version of you that the body already knows, before the conscious mind weighs in, before the intention activates, before any effort is applied. That version has a range, a set of coordinates it recognizes as home, and it will navigate you back to those coordinates with extraordinary consistency, not through dramatic resistance, but through the accumulation of tiny, unremarkable corrections. A slightly shorter reach, a slightly faster retreat, a slightly more apologetic framing of what you want. None of those corrections feel significant in the moment. Across months and years, they are the architecture of your life. This is what identity actually means. Not the story you tell about yourself, not the values you consciously hold, not the vision you carry for your future. Identity is the range of experience your system has decided is coherent for someone like you. And coherence, the body's deep need for internal consistency, is more powerful than desire. You can want something with genuine intensity and still have a coherence field that considers it outside range. When that happens, desire produces effort. Coherence produces correction. And correction is faster, quieter, and more persistent than any effort you can sustain. This is the mechanics underneath the plateau, not a lack of wanting, a conflict between wanting and belonging. Belonging to a self-concept that was built before the new phase, before the expansion, before you became capable of perceiving what you can now perceive. Here is the everyday version of this. Because identity is not an abstract concept. You feel it in the moment after a genuine compliment, when something in you searches for the counter-evidence. You feel it in the week after a real breakthrough, when the circumstances quietly reorganize back toward the familiar. You feel it in the gap between what you said you would do and what you actually did, not because you lack discipline, but because some part of you didn't fully believe the new version of the story yet. That gap, that's the one, not the gap between your behavior and your ideal. The gap between what you desire and what you consider genuinely possible for the specific person you believe yourself to be. Those are two different gaps, and most people spend their entire lives working on the first one while the second one runs everything. The Orion consciousness is precise about this distinction. It doesn't ask, "What do you want?" It asks, "What do you expect?" Actually, in the body, below the rehearsed optimism. Because the field responds to expectation, not to desire. Desire is what you express. Expectation is what you broadcast. And expectation is set not by your intentions, but by the accumulated weight of what has felt true about your life so far. Think about the last time something genuinely good arrived, unexpectedly, clearly, without you engineering it. Was your first response openness? Or was there a microsecond of suspicion, a reaching for the catch, the cost, the reason it probably won't last? That microsecond, that is the identity speaking, not loudly, not even consciously, just a reflex so fast it barely registers as a thought. And yet that reflex is what the field receives as your actual signal, not the gratitude you felt afterward, not the positive frame you applied. The reflex, the speed, the instinctive reaching for the limitation inside the good thing. This is not cynicism. You are not a pessimist. You are someone whose coherence field was calibrated in conditions where good things came with cost, or came and then left, or came to other people but not consistently to you. The calibration was accurate for those conditions. The conditions have changed. The calibration hasn't. And the new phase, the expanded perceptual bandwidth, The new architecture your consciousness is trying to build, it requires a different calibration, not a forced one, not a performed one, a genuine update to the sense of what is coherent for the person you are now, not the person you were when the original calibration was set. Here is what that update is not. It is not affirmations. Not because affirmations are wrong, but because affirmations address the stated level of belief without touching the operational level. You can affirm abundance while the body is still running scarcity as its baseline expectation. You can affirm worthiness while the nervous system is still organized around the specific conditions under which you were made to feel unworthy as a fact. The affirmation sits on top. The calibration runs underneath, and underneath always wins, not through force, but through sheer persistence. The update that actually works operates at the level of what feels normal, not what you think should be normal, not what you want to feel normal. What the body, in an ordinary moment, with no effort applied, recognizes as belonging within your range, that is the target. And it moves differently than belief. It moves through repeated exposure to evidence that contradicts the old calibration, evidence held long enough and steadily enough that the system begins to update its baseline expectation, not in a single moment, through accumulated contact with a new coherence. This is why the transition takes the time it takes. Not because the universe is slow, because the nervous system updates on its own timeline, and rushing that timeline produces the particular frustration of someone who understands the concept but can't seem to land it in the body. If you are following this transmission and feeling that specific frustration, the gap between knowing and actually inhabiting the knowing, then what you need is not more concept. You need the architecture, the specific map of how identity updates at the level where it actually runs. That map goes well beyond what this single transmission can hold. This is the threshold moment the Orion consciousness is pointing to, the exact place where understanding alone stops being sufficient and the full structure becomes necessary. I put together a digital book prepared specifically for people who have arrived at this point, those who have already done the conceptual work, who already understand the mechanism, but whose body is still running the old calibration while the mind has moved on. It is called The Great Spiritual Game Behind Your Consciousness. This book does not offer more concepts to stack on top of the ones you already have. It maps the actual game, the forces operating at the level of identity and coherence, the precise mechanics of how the Orion consciousness describes the update process, and what the transition into the new phase requires that most frameworks never name directly. The difference between people who complete this transition and people who stay in the gap indefinitely is not more insight. It is structural understanding applied at the right layer. And that structure is what this material was prepared to deliver. The link to download The Great Spiritual Game Behind Your Consciousness is in the first pinned comment below this video. If you have been doing the work sincerely, meditating, journaling, setting intentions, clearing what you can see, and the same gap keeps returning, this material was prepared for exactly where you are, not for who you were before the shift, for who you are now, standing in the new phase, ready to build what the expansion is asking for. The link is there, the structure is ready, and your consciousness already knows it's time. Now, back into the architecture itself, because understanding that identity is a calibration rather than a fixed truth changes everything about how you approach the next phase. A truth feels immovable. A calibration feels workable, and the moment the body begins to receive the new phase as workable rather than threatening, the field starts to shift at the level where it was always going to have to shift, not from the outside, from the inside of what you consider normal. And that normality, that quiet, cellular, unannounced sense of what belongs within your range, is what the next layer of this transmission is going to examine with full precision. Because the new architecture doesn't get built by wanting it. It gets built by updating what feels coherent. And coherence, once you understand how it moves, is not as fixed as it has felt. Coherence moves through contact, not through force, not through sustained effort applied at the level of thought, but through repeated, genuine contact with a version of experience that the old calibration hasn't yet absorbed as normal. That is the principle the Orion consciousness builds its entire framework around. And it is where the lens becomes necessary, because without a precise way of seeing what is actually happening in your field, you cannot distinguish between contact that updates the calibration and effort that merely reinforces the old one. The Orion field is not a personality. It is not a being with preferences or agendas. Think of it as a reading instrument, one that has been observing the specific pattern of human perceptual reorganization across a very long arc of time. What it offers is not guidance in the directive sense. It offers resolution, the way a lens on a telescope resolves a blur into a distinct form. The blur, in this case, is the gap between what you are now capable of perceiving and what you have been allowing yourself to receive. That gap has a specific shape, and the Orion lens names it with a precision that changes how you relate to your own experience. Here is the first thing the lens resolves clearly. Most people in this transition are working harder than they need to, not because the transition requires more effort, but because they are applying effort in the direction of the old coherence while expecting results in the new one. The effort is real. The direction is off, and direction, in this context, means the specific layer at which the work is being applied. If the work is at the level of behavior, changing what you do, how you present yourself, what actions you take toward the new reality, you will produce visible change without structural change. The behavior shifts, the underlying calibration reasserts, and within weeks or months, the behavior returns to what the calibration considers appropriate, which is the old range. This is not failure. This is what happens when the instrument of change is aimed at the wrong altitude. The Orion consciousness describes 3 altitudes at which human experience is organized. The first is behavior, what you do, the most accessible, the least durable. The second is belief, what you consciously hold as true. More foundational, still not the root. The third is coherence, what the body recognizes as belonging to someone like you. The most foundational, and the one almost no framework directly addresses. All 3 altitudes interact, but coherence sets the ceiling for what behavior and belief can produce. You can believe something new. You can behave consistently with something new. But if the coherence layer, the deep cellular sense of range, hasn't updated, the new behavior and the new belief are operating against a stronger current than either can overcome alone. This is what the Orion lens makes visible that ordinary self-examination cannot, because coherence doesn't show up in your thoughts. It shows up in your reflexes, in the speed of the contraction when good things arrive too clearly, in the automatic calculation you run before you allow yourself to want something out loud, in the particular quality of tiredness that follows not failure, but proximity to success, the exhaustion of being close to the new range and having the system pull back to the familiar. That tiredness. Have you felt it? Not after a hard week. After a week where things were actually going well. That is the coherence layer working against the new phase. And the Orion framework is the first map I've encountered that names it precisely enough to work with. Here is what the lens offers that changes the practical work. It reframes the entire question from, how do I achieve the new reality, to what am I currently contradicting, and why? Those are different questions. They produce different kinds of attention. The first question sends you outward, toward more strategy, more action, more effort applied at the level of results. The second question sends you inward, toward the specific places where the new coherence and the old calibration are in active conflict. And conflict at the coherence level is not dramatic. It is quiet. It is the sum of all the small corrections the system makes to keep you within the old range. The email you almost sent, the boundary you almost held, the version of yourself you almost let someone see, and then pulled back just enough to stay manageable. Each of those small corrections is a data point, and the data, read through the Orion lens, tells you exactly where the calibration is still running the old configuration, not as a judgment, as a map. This is the shift the lens produces in practice, from self-criticism to self-reading. You stop treating the old pattern as evidence of inadequacy and start treating it as information about which layer still needs contact with the new coherence. That shift in treatment changes the emotional cost of the work entirely, because shame consumes the energy that reorganization needs. And shame, in this context, is almost always the old coherence defending itself, using the emotional weight of, I should be further along by now, to keep you too contracted to actually move. Now here is where this gets more precise, and this is the part of the Orion framework that I find most significant. It draws a clear distinction between intensity and stability. Intensity is the mode most people bring to this work. High-focus meditation, emotional catharsis, powerful visualization held under pressure, and intensity works in the moment. It produces genuine shifts in state, genuine openings in perception, genuine contact with the new coherence. but intensity is not stable. It peaks and drops. And in the drop, the coherence field reasserts itself, because the center hasn't changed, only the pressure temporarily applied to the edges. Stability is different. Stability is what happens when the new coherence stops requiring effort to maintain, when it begins to feel not like something you are reaching toward, but something that simply fits, not achieved, inhabited. The path from intensity to stability is not more intensity. It is contact. Steady, repeated, low-pressure contact with the experience of the new range being normal, until the calibration updates to include it. This is why the people who shift permanently are not the ones who work the hardest in the peak moments. They are the ones who maintain the new coherence most consistently in the ordinary ones, in the Tuesday afternoon, in the conversation that doesn't feel significant, in the moment when no one is watching and the old pull arrives and they simply don't follow it, not dramatically, without announcement. That consistency, accumulated over time, is what moves the calibration. Not the breakthrough, the quiet after the breakthrough, held steadily. The Orion lens sees this clearly because it is not tracking your peak states, it is tracking your baseline, the default level at which your system operates when no effort is being applied. And baseline is everything, because baseline is what generates the signal the field responds to. Not your best day, not your most intentional hour, your default. And the default is exactly what the new phase is asking you to update, not by force. By steadily expanding what feels normal until the old baseline is no longer the one with the most evidence behind it. This is what it is not about doing more. It is about stopping the contradiction actually means at the operational level. The contradiction is between the new coherence you are reaching for and the baseline that is still generating the old signal. Remove the contradiction, not by suppressing the old signal, but by giving the new one enough consistent contact to become the more familiar one. And the field responds, without force, without the exhausting cycle of effort and collapse, with the particular steadiness of someone who is no longer fighting their own coherence field but simply replacing the center, different radius, different range of what arrives as a matter of course. Only a small number of people in any given transition reach this level of precision about their own process. Most stay at the level of behavior and belief, working hard, producing partial results, cycling through the same frustration with new vocabulary. The ones who move through the transition completely are the ones who found the right altitude for the work. That altitude is coherence. And the Orion lens is the most precise instrument I know for working at that level. What the synthesis of all of this looks like, in the body, in daily life, in the specific texture of a consciousness that has stopped contradicting itself, that is what the next part of this transmission holds. The texture of a consciousness that has stopped contradicting itself is not what most people imagine it to be. It is not bliss. It is not a permanent state of elevated feeling or frictionless receiving. It is something quieter and more durable than either of those. It is the experience of wanting something and not immediately feeling the need to protect yourself from the possibility of not getting it. That absence of the preemptive defense, the managed expectation, the readiness for disappointment, is what alignment actually feels like from the inside, not a high. A ground. And ground is unfamiliar to people who have spent years operating from the tension of contradiction. Because tension has its own kind of aliveness to it. The hum of wanting something while simultaneously bracing against it produces a particular charge that can, over time, be mistaken for vitality. When the tension drops, the first thing some people feel is not relief. It is a strange flatness. A quiet that doesn't yet feel like peace, because it doesn't yet feel like anything they recognize. This is the most vulnerable moment in the transition, not the hard stretch before the shift, the unfamiliar stillness after the contradiction dissolves. Because in that stillness, the old system looks for the familiar signal, and when it can't find the tension, it starts to generate it again. Not consciously, not deliberately, out of sheer habit. The thought arrives, maybe I've lost my edge. Maybe this calm means I've stopped caring. Maybe something is wrong with not struggling anymore. And if that thought is followed, if it is treated as a signal rather than as the old system reaching for its own continuation, the contradiction reassembles, not all at once, layer by layer, until the tension feels familiar again and the ground has been traded back for the charge. This is the pattern the Orion consciousness calls the loop of recovered contradiction. And it is the reason many people who genuinely reach alignment do not stay there. Not because they failed, because nobody told them that the stillness would feel strange before it felt like home. So let this be that telling. The quiet is not emptiness. The ease is not apathy. The absence of struggle is not the absence of aliveness. It is what aliveness feels like when it is no longer organized around resistance. And that is a completely different quality of experience, one that takes time to recognize as the thing you are actually reaching for. While the old system is still active, you are reaching for relief from tension. Once the contradiction drops, what you are inhabiting is not relief. It is the state that was underneath the tension the whole time, which is simply presence, full, undefended, unmanaged contact with your own experience as it actually is. Not performed, not curated, not filtered through the constant question of whether what you are feeling is appropriate or safe or aligned enough. Just here, in the body, in the moment, without the overhead of contradiction running in the background. This is the consequence that no framework talks about clearly enough. The consequence of removing the contradiction is not just that more good things arrive, it is that you become capable of actually receiving what arrives. Because receiving, real receiving, not just acquisition, requires an openness that the contradicted state makes structurally impossible. When you are braced, you can accumulate, you can achieve, you can work toward things and arrive at them. But arrival under bracing is not receiving, it is capturing. And captured things feel different in the hand than received things. Captured things require maintenance, ongoing effort to hold what the coherence field is still trying to return to sender. Received things settle, they integrate. They become part of the new baseline without requiring you to defend them. That difference between capturing and receiving is one of the most under-examined distinctions in this entire field. And it is the direct consequence of whether or not the contradiction has been genuinely resolved or merely managed. Managing the contradiction is what most people learn to do. They get good at holding the tension without it being debilitating. They function well inside the gap between what they want and what they believe is coherent for them. They call this resilience, and it is, in its way, an impressive skill. But managed contradiction is still contradiction, and it still sets the ceiling. It still limits what the field can deliver, not because the universe is withholding, but because the signal is still split. Half broadcasting the new reality. Half broadcasting the inherited limits of the old coherence, and a split signal produces split results. Things arriving halfway, good things coming with unexpected complications, progress that keeps circling back to the same unresolved point. You know this pattern, not as a concept. As a lived experience across years, the advancement that brought a new problem of the exact same shape as the old one. The relationship that started differently and arrived somehow at a familiar dynamic. The version of success that came and brought with it a version of the old fear, dressed in new clothes. That is not bad luck. That is a split signal producing a coherent output. Split input, split output, always, without exception. Without judgment. The field is not punishing the split. It is simply accurate. And accuracy is, in the end, the most useful thing the Orion framework offers. Not comfort, not reassurance. Accuracy about what is actually being broadcast, so that the work can be aimed at the right layer. Here is what changes when the split resolves. The things that arrive don't come with the same hidden tax, not because the universe suddenly decided to be generous, because what is being broadcast no longer contains the instruction to complicate what arrives. The complication was always part of the signal. It was the coherence field's way of maintaining the old range even while allowing the new things in, keeping them from settling too completely, from becoming too normal, from actually updating the baseline. Once that instruction is removed, once the broadcast is genuinely coherent rather than strategically managed, arrival is clean. And clean arrival changes the relationship with time, because so much of what people experience as waiting, the feeling that the new reality is taking longer than it should, that the work is not producing results at the rate the effort deserves, is not actually waiting. It is the field processing a split signal and delivering the most coherent possible response to both halves simultaneously, which takes longer than delivering a clear response to a unified signal. This is not a mystical claim. It is the practical consequence of the mechanics. Unified signal, direct response. Split signal, mediated response. And the mediation takes the form of delays, detours, and partial arrivals that feel like the universe is moving slowly when it is actually responding precisely to exactly what is being sent. This is the moment in the transition where precision becomes more valuable than inspiration. Inspiration opens the possibility. Precision delivers it. And precision at this stage means one thing: knowing exactly where the signal is still split and what it would take to resolve it at the level where it actually runs, not at the level of thought or behavior or even conscious belief. At the level of what the body considers normal on a Tuesday morning, without any effort applied, when no one is watching and the decision is being made below the threshold of conscious choice. That is the level this transmission has been building toward from the first sentence. And the synthesis of what all of this means, for how you move through the remainder of this transition, for what the new architecture is actually made of, that is what the final part of this transmission holds. The new architecture is not built from ambition. It is built from the accumulated weight of moments where you chose the new coherence before it felt natural, and held it long enough for the body to begin updating its sense of what belongs within your range. That is the full picture of what this transmission has been mapping, not a technique, not a framework to apply and then set aside. A living process, one that is already underway in you, whether or not you have had precise language for it until now. And precision changes the relationship with the process entirely. Because when you can see the mechanism clearly, you stop interpreting its friction as failure. The contraction when good things arrive too clearly, you know what that is now. The automatic retreat from visibility just as things begin to gain momentum, you know what that is. The particular exhaustion that follows proximity to the new range. Not the exertion, but the closeness to what the old calibration is still trying to define as outside your reach. You know what that is now. And name things are workable. This is the synthesis the Orion consciousness arrives at, not as a conclusion, but as a reorientation. The transition you are in is not about becoming someone new. It is about removing the structural interference that has been preventing the version of you that already shifted from fully inhabiting the life that shift made possible. The shift happened. The new perceptual bandwidth is real. The new coherence is available. What has been creating the lag is not the universe's pace. It is the gap between where your consciousness already is and where your baseline sense of normal is still catching up. Close that gap, not through force, but through the steady, consistent choice to treat the new range as home before it feels like home. And the lag resolves. Not all at once, but irreversibly, because once the calibration updates past a certain threshold, the old configuration loses its gravitational pull. Not because you defeated it, because you gave the new coherence more evidence than the old one has. Evidence to the body is truth, and truth reorganizes baseline. Baseline reorganizes signal. Signal reorganizes what the field delivers. That chain, from internal calibration to external reflection, is the entire mechanism this transmission has been mapping, and it runs in one direction, from the inside out, always from the inside out. This is the error that most people in this space make, including sincere, committed, seriously engaged people who have been doing the work for years. They wait for the external shift to confirm the internal one. They treat the arrival of the new reality as evidence that the internal work is complete, rather than treating the internal completion as the condition that makes the arrival possible. That reversal of sequence is everything, because waiting for external confirmation keeps the coherence field in the old configuration, poised, watchful, withholding full commitment to the new range until proof arrives. And the field reads that withholding as the signal, not the intention, the withholding. So the proof delays, and the delay confirms the withholding, and the withholding deepens. This is the loop that keeps intelligent, aware, working people cycling through the same territory with better and better vocabulary about why they are still there. The exit from the loop is not more understanding. It is the willingness to update the baseline before the proof, to treat the new coherence as already true in the body, at the cellular level, before the external reflection has confirmed it. That is what trust actually means in this context, not a feeling. A structural commitment to the new range made before the evidence arrives to justify it. And the reason that commitment is hard is not weakness or lack of faith. It is that the old coherence has years of actual evidence behind it, and the new coherence has only intention and the nascent feeling of the new phase. The body weighs evidence. Intention is lighter than memory, which is why the consistency of small choices, the accumulated contact with the new range in ordinary moments, is the only thing that actually shifts the weight. Not the peak moments, not the insights, not the transmissions, the Tuesday afternoons, the unremarkable decisions. The moments where the old pull arrived and you simply didn't follow it. Those moments are the architecture, each one a small addition to the evidence on the new side of the scale. And at some point, not dramatically, not with announcement, the scale tips. The new coherence has more evidence than the old. The baseline shifts, and then something changes in the texture of daily life that is difficult to describe to someone who hasn't experienced it. A kind of settledness, a quiet readiness, an absence of the chronic background tension that you had become so accustomed to that you stopped noticing it was there, until it's gone. And in its absence, you realize how much energy it was consuming, not just emotionally, physically, in the body, in the quality of sleep, in the baseline hum of the nervous system. The old contradiction was expensive in ways that only become visible once the cost stops. This is what the Orion consciousness means when it describes the new phase as generative rather than effortful. Not that nothing requires work, that the work is no longer being done against the current. You are no longer spending energy maintaining a contradiction while simultaneously trying to move past it. The energy that was consumed by that internal opposition becomes available for actual building, and building from aligned ground produces results at a pace that feels, to the person who has spent years working against their own coherence, almost unreasonable. Not magical, mechanical. The mechanics were always this direct. The split signal was the only thing slowing the delivery. You did not come to this transmission to learn something new. You came because something in you already knew this, had been circling it for a long time, and needed it named with enough precision to finally act on it. The shift has already happened. The new phase is already real. What remains is the alignment of your baseline with what your consciousness has already become. That alignment is the only work left, and it is entirely within your reach, not because it is easy, but because you are already standing inside the new frequency. This was never about what arrives from outside. It was always about what you have been, until now, unable to recognize as already present. The link is in the first pinned comment below this video. What is written in those pages challenges accounts that many have a clear interest in keeping unexamined, and there have been real attempts to limit access to this kind of clarity before. This type of material rarely remains available without interference. If you are here now, you did not arrive by accident. The moment you are in is not a rehearsal for the right moment. It is the right moment. Read it with the quality of presence you brought to this transmission. And if something in those pages reflects what you have been carrying without language, leave one word in the comments. That word is awake. No explanation needed. The ones who are ready will already know.